Hello and welcome once again to episode 22 of Code Completion. We are a group of iOS developers and educators hoping to share what we love most about development, Apple technology, and completing your code. My name is Dimitri, and I'll be your host once again for this episode, and I'm joined today by my fellow completionists, Fernando.
Hello.
Hi.
And Ben. So before we get into our main topic, it's time for our Indie App Spotlight. Fernando?
Thank you, Dimitri. So today we'll be talking about a few really amazing apps. For those of you that don't know, Indie App Spotlight is a small section in our podcast where we give back to the community, specifically indie devs, and we promote a little bit of the amazing talent that we have in the Apple ecosystem and community. First, we have Print to Size by Seb. This is a really interesting app that basically allows you to print your photos exactly to the size of the paper that you're trying to print. So no more fiddling with your printer. You basically go to your photos, go to your app, select the size, get a real preview, and get it going. Really, really cool. The one thing I wanted to mention about that app is that I saw a few really amazing users posting YouTube videos as to how to use the app. And that to me is the maximum level of like a compliment you can get when you're in the app. Like when other users like post tutorials, that's it. You've made it.
Definitely.
The second app that we have in the showcase is called Copies by Martin Pilkington. And it's a really interesting app, which it's basically a place where you can sort your thoughts visually. So you can start writing a note, and if that note branches out into something totally different, you create a new note, and then you visually link them. It's really, really interesting. And I'm going to be using it a little bit because I'm trying to get my whole mailing list in order, and there's always articles and blog ideas and things like that. It's a really, really cool concept. I'm sure it's going to be useful for a lot of people. The last app that we have today on our Indie App Spotlight segment is Tumult Hype, which is an interesting Mac app where it allows you to design animations based on keyframes. So it's really, really well done. You can create the animations and you can export the animations on, like for HTML5, they work really, really well on mobile. You can extend them using the power of JavaScript. So it's really a really well done application for if you're interested in animations. I think I really, really like this app because it brings back it really shows me that there's people out there who worry about the small details and the design of Mac apps. So I really recommend you guys check any of these apps out. And thanks to the developers for building such amazing apps.
So are you an indie developer? We want to hear from you. Our list is long at the moment, but please reach out to us on Twitter at Code Completion so we can spotlight your app too. So as we record, this is kind of our more or less the last time that most of us on the podcast will be a formal instructor teaching at a school. So I am joining Fernando and Ben and working on regular old projects once again. However, unlike Ben and I, Fernando has been jumping back into teaching, but in a slightly different vein. So do you want to kind of talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, of course. So as you guys know, I've actually said it in the podcast once or twice. I wrote a book about not a framework in and of itself, but understanding how to code. Like going into a code base, understanding what the code base is all about, fixing bugs, adding features, things like that, which is a totally different process than what you do when you go into a tutorial, right? A tutorial is about absorbing information. And when you're in a code base, it's all about like having to modify the pieces so that you can put in an intermediate piece or change the size of a piece or things like that. So I started designing a course where I found an open source iOS app and I open up issues and add new features to it. Basically, I create the tickets or the stories or what have you as atomic entities that have instructions. And I am offering that as a course. So the course is all about um, like cloning the repo, and I give you a story that says, hey, you know what? This isn't getting updated whenever we press this button. Go and fix it. So there's very little guidance when you go into the code base. The amount of guidance and feedback that I give is once you get into the code review section of it. So I've been lucky enough to have a few people beta tested, and I have current one paying customer. Yay. And in all the instances, both beta testing and with the customer, I've seen it that they get value immediately, because having someone tell you, no, please don't refactor the whole thing. No, please don't do this in Swift UI. Please focus on doing this. Forget about that. And what's really funny is the constant comments that I get from my students are that, oh my God, this code sucks. Oh no, can we fix this? Oh, can we fix that? And I think that's a very important lesson that you don't learn until you're at work, which is no, you can't fix that right now. No, you can't refactor the whole thing. No, we can't use Swift UI right now. So I think it's a really interesting concept that I'm trying to um, get out there. And yeah, I don't know, what do you guys think about it?
It's certainly a very different take because you have to be lucky to join a company that will actually
Right.
provide that feedback to begin with. Like many times, there's going to be no code review process. No one's going to be looking at what you add. And it's going to be far too late once the problems of your big refactor kind of surface up because no one really asked for it and you kind of broke everyone's usage of it other than the one case that you tested, right? And that is often super difficult to kind of narrow down. And it's hard to find a team that actually cares enough to mentor you through that process at the same time that you are kind of learning the new code base, no matter what level of experience you have. Like depending on the code base, you can have a ton of experience, but you have no experience with that code base, so you're just as far as step one as anyone else is. So it's really exciting to see you kind of experiment with this different way of learning to be a better programmer, especially since it's not something that is really out there. One, as a product that you're kind of presenting it as, but two, even after you join, like unless you find a team that's willing to kind of mentor you as a junior, and the seniors on that team are willing to put the work in to kind of make sure that you are improving, so that way the team gets better. Like secrets that we're kind of sharing here. You get a better team if you mentor them to be better programmers. But that the fact that that's not available really makes this a good thing
Yeah,
to
I
have.
think that it's interesting. It's interesting that it doesn't exist really. That no one has. I'm sure people have probably thought of it, but that interesting that there's like not really a market for it. So like the question is the market not there because everyone's just ignoring it, or because it's not viable, or I mean you're figuring all that out, right? So I think it's really interesting that you're trying it, and I certainly hope that there is enough of a market there that you can just sort of sustain the effort to do it. And I think it's a really interesting and novel way to go about furthering learning, right? It's probably not appropriate for someone who doesn't know how to code at all, right? This wouldn't be their first step, of course, right?
Yeah.
But fortunately, there that sort of part of the market is very well covered, right? I mean, there's tons of great resources for beginners. We were having a little sort of like hangout session this afternoon with my team from my job today, who are mostly Lambda School grads. I've been fortunate enough to be able to build a team at my company, and when they were like, "Who do you want?" I was like, "Well, I want juniors, and I want specifically, people who were my students. I think that's going to be the best sort of path to success for us." And they were like, "Cool, let's do it." And so what's been really great is I've been able to build a team that is made up of mostly of my former students from Lambda School, and we were talking about kind of how you start and how you get further and stuff like that. And I was saying that it's really really comparatively easy to write content as an educator when you're starting from zero, right? And I think that's probably why it is the most popular content available, right?
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
actually so it's as a learner, as a student, it's often very frustrating to you do that tutorial basically over and over again by different people, and you're like, okay, I got this, I understand how that works, like take me to the next step, right? What is the next step for going a little further, building a slightly larger app, or even if you're a mid or a senior, right? I mean, I'm sure that I have all kinds of like bad habits, and there's probably improvements to architecture that I could make in the way that I design and build iOS apps. And a lot of times that knowledge is pretty locked up in, a fairly small group of people. The most senior people at like large companies and stuff like that are the ones that kind of hold all those cards, and they're not really typically very easily shared. So I think it's really cool that you're trying this, and I hope that it works, because not only will I think it potentially help, people who are like, I got a little bit, but I need help in sort of getting to the next level. But also maybe you could, if this goes well and you expand a little bit more, you might even end up in a scenario where you're like, I'm going to bring on some basically senior level engineers to help them level up as well, right? Help them understand sort of more of like the architecture role, right? Like,
That's interesting. Yeah, that's an
because it's
interesting idea.
what
for
you've
sure.
got really doesn't depend on, or it's sort of the model that you've built, right? Doesn't really, the input of the person where they are today isn't as important, because you can create sort of a playground. I don't mean like Xcode playground. I mean like just a playground in the general sense, for them to sort of, play and to practice and stuff like that. And you can then sort of coordinate that thing to solve whatever problem they're trying to solve in their educational journey, right? And so that could even include, because that's something that I feel like, as a group of people that we suffer from, is oftentimes we will get to senior level developer, right? And then that's kind of it. Like there's oftentimes not really anywhere else to go, and depending on what size company you work at or whatever. But I do feel like there is definitely more room to grow within there, right? To sort of, I'm gonna take on basically, working with the back end developers and the front end developers and the web and the iOS app and maybe the Android app and stuff, right? Like I'm basically describing my job at my current company, which I'm director of mobile engineering. So my job it was initially, when I first got hired, because I was the only mobile team member, was to literally sit down and open Xcode and write all of the code that we were going to use, right, for the app. And I still do that, but a little bit less so recently. And that's in part because I've kind of hired a team, and I've also sort of stepped into a position where my job now, like I spent a decent amount of time today in an entity relationship diagram modeling tool, building the database schema for the mobile apps, right?
Yeah.
So like that's still a job that needs to be done. And if you're a one person team, you just do everything, right? But like in this situation, I do that, and then I explain what I've done to the backend people, and I explain what I've done to my mobile team, and like we talk about it, and I make changes, and like it's a different role, but it's still very technical. And I feel like there is that kind of thing, right? Like that is a thing that people could, if they get bored or they feel like glass ceilinged, right? They feel like they're stuck in this spot where they can't really go any further up the corporate ladder, to mix a bunch of metaphors together. They,
But no, I think your idea is really interesting, because the person I was sort of aiming for is myself from the past. And I've seen this on like from several students, where you join a company where they either bait and switch it, where it's like, oh, of course you'll get someone to mentor you throughout the blah blah, and then you join and they're just like, well, you're the only iOS guy, and you're like, it's literally happened a few times in the past few months, where students of mine have come to me and be like, but what do I do? And
get a new job is what you do.
I guess you just work at it. Yeah, well, yeah. So, and that's really funny, but it's like it's exactly what you're saying when you're a senior, where sometimes it's like you get to a point where you're like, I'm pretty good at what I do. Like I can still
Right.
learn by myself, but still like things like you just I'm just thinking off the top of my head, like
Yeah.
giving a good code review. Like that's not something you learn
Right.
until you keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and people tell you, "Wow,
Right.
you're a really good reviewer," or "Wow, this guy, I hope he
Right.
doesn't review my code." And
Hmm.
setting up a
Yeah.
scenario like that would be really interesting, where you present someone with the code from a junior, and you're like,
Yeah.
"Okay, go and code review it."
Teaching people how to be good
Uh,
mentors, right? Teaching people how to communicate effectively cross
Hmm.
function, so that if you need to convince the back end team to do something a particular way to make it so the mobile team doesn't have sort of a nightmare on their hands, that's a skill too that you're not going to learn by sitting by yourself coding away, right, with your headphones on. Like, it's a skill that you need to learn either through practice because you're forced to, or practice because maybe you choose to, right? Maybe you choose to take a course with Fernando where you learn how to do that, right? So I think what's really cool about your model is that it really kind of, it really would work kind of for all ages welcome, right? Like every skill level of developer probably could benefit from your pedagogical design, right? Because the subject matter is fairly fluid in what you could present in this kind of scenario, um, and I think it's a if you look at kind of the state of the programming world. So we could certainly use people who were better mentors, people who were better at cross-functional
yeah,
communication, people who were better at promoting the ideas of others, right? Like those are all kind of the things that we get, that as a community we get sort of blasted on regularly on social media for being a bunch of broy, like, kind of just jerks, right?
yeah, and it's true. Like we get
Hmm.
blasted on
Yeah.
social media because it's true. The community is
Yeah, so I think I
really
think
like
there's a
that.
really cool sort of angle here where not only can you sort of educate to educate, right, but you can also infuse better ethics into our community, which is something that
Hmm.
I've become
Yeah,
kind of more aware of recently. And like,
aware of. Yeah,
in obviously I can't fix everything myself, right? And it would be silly to put that burden. It's silly to put that burden on any particular person. So please don't, anybody in the audience, don't ever feel like, yeah, it kind of sucks sometimes, but like, do what you can and then sort of be happy with the progress that you're making yourself and that you're encouraging in others, but don't feel like
yeah,
you have to fix the entire thing. Unfortunately, I've seen so many people on Twitter recently, particularly like, women in our community and stuff, who just sort of lament,
yeah,
right? Like how bad it is, or they
Or
gave
gave
up, or
up.
they're about to give up, or right. and
yeah,
and I really hope they don't give up, because I think people of all different stripes need to be here, and you can't fix everything yourself, and you have to just sort of do what you can, and call people out when they're being
yeah.
jerks, and just kind of, I don't know. I didn't mean for this to turn into a soapbox, but like,
No, but you can do like it's the whole. I just saw a
uh-huh.
tweet by DHH saying that they changed the main branch in
Mm-hmm.
Ruby from master to main, and my comment on that was that it's very few times it's
Right.
about solving the problem. A lot of the time, it's just about making it a little bit easier to
Right.
overcome the problem,
Yeah,
and
Right.
that
making
like
people feel
the
welcome.
yeah, changing from master to main, solving it was it will it solve all like the
Right.
racism problem that we have in tech? No, by
Right.
like not by a long shot. Will it make it easier? Like will is it one
Right.
small step in the right
Right.
direction? Yeah, it is.
And in
So
fact,
it's
that
just like
particular
that.
usage of
Um,
I,
language wasn't really intended. It wasn't a master slave thing. It was really the person who invented that said that they were using the idea of like a master recording, like sort of the progenitor recording, right? The
oh, makes
thing that
sense.
is the originator of everything else. But like, who cares, right? Like it is not a big. It takes literally 2 seconds to do that, to change that name and that branch. So whether it is something that is, you know, whether it was like from a language point of view, the correct or the the thing people thought it was or not, it doesn't. Who cares? It's an easy change, and it makes it
Yeah,
feel
exactly.
more inclusive. So like, why not, right?
And if that kind of change, like if you find that bothers you, that's a good point to kind of slow down and to think about
Yeah.
why that's bothering you in the first place, because it really shouldn't.
Right.
It's something so inoffensive to
Right.
kind of change a word like that. That if it is something that causes you to like have a knee jerk reaction, really stop to think about why that's causing that, because there's probably a different way you can go about thinking about it to be just a better
Yeah.
member of the community. Now, if you do want to hear a whole lot more about ethics and you're just joining this podcast with this episode, do listen 2 episodes ago, because we did have a large discussion on ethics
Nice.
in technology. So we elaborated a ton on that. Going back to the topic, something that I think is very important with what Fernando is kind of bringing to the table here are these
Yeah.
contrived examples, right? Putting the work into kind of coming up
Yeah.
with an example that is realistic, that you are going to come across, but like if you don't put the effort in, you're never going to quite overcome.
Hmm.
So one example of that that I ran into a ton when I was still teaching are merge conflicts. Merge conflicts are hard to kind of instigate on your own, because they either come up, and whenever they come up, they're really nasty, and it's hard to kind of have something. Um, it's hard to have an example where you will reliably come up against the same exact conflict that's going to cause a conflict in the storyboard at this point and know how to fix it. And even if you solve that one, you didn't solve all the rest of the kind of merge conflicts that you can kind of run into. So kind of finding where these examples can kind of come up, that's the gold of
Yeah.
this, and that's really hard. So that Fernando is kind of taking up the
Yeah.
mantle of finding areas that we can improve as developers, whether we are seniors, whether we are juniors, I think is really important, because ultimately you have to be willing to learn and to improve
Yeah.
yourself no matter what level you are. It's so easy to come to the table saying, hey, I have 20 years of experience, I know what's best, but you don't realize why you know best. And you might
Yeah.
know the wrong thing. Like, this is kind of a tangent, but earlier today we were all talking about the etymology of a word, and I thought I knew it in one particular way, but I wasn't sure of myself, so I looked it up. And it turns out that none of the references that I could find thought of it the same way that I did. So, like, that is an excellent opportunity to kind of rethink and reevaluate what you know, because generally speaking, you tend to collect these nuggets of information and you
Mm-hmm.
think they are absolute, but they might not be. Just like we assumed the master branch comes from the master slave kind of
Right.
like naming that we use in databases and things like that, which comes from a much
Right.
more horrible past of naming things. So just because that etymology is not there, it's important to kind of learn how we got to somewhere. Like, we shouldn't just push master under the rug and never talk about it again and just have main everywhere. That's just erasing
Right.
the problem, and then we don't
Yeah.
realize what the problem was. Um, but it's important to learn the history of all these things and to realize that everything has its flaws, but that's not a deal breaker. Things can be improved as long as you realize like
Mm-hmm.
what those shortcomings were, and that goes for
Yeah.
your own knowledge as well. Like, you need to be open to learning new things, and then no matter what level of experience you are at, you can go ahead and really improve
Yeah.
dramatically. So
I
having
think
something that's at all levels is great.
I agree 100%. I think that's actually a good segue to something that I learned while building this course, which is uh, for the longest time, and I still hold that view, but not so strongly. I was against like third-party libraries. Like we've all discussed this at length. Maybe we should do an episode on CocoaPods uh, to get all the
Burn them down.
feelings
No, I'm
out.
just kidding.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's
A
what I'm
little
talking
like
about.
therapy session just to get it all
But
out.
it's
Right.
like yeah, exactly. So for the longest time, I've been against it because it's in general good practice in our ecosystem to just stay as close to the first party as possible because things change constantly. Like Apple upgrades every year. And for the longest time, I sort of didn't realize that we have a lot of open source code. Like you can, when you think of open source code, you think like, oh well,
Mm-hmm.
Alamo Fire or MessageKit or like a few
Mm-hmm.
select libraries that you may use. And while looking for projects for this course, I found out that there's like a ton of apps out there that are MIT licensed. And I find that so cool. And it goes to Dimitri's point that for the longest time, I was like, iOS is not an ecosystem that deals with open source. You go to JavaScript and there's, what is
Mm-hmm.
it, NPM? And then you get libraries for
Yeah.
adding to numbers that someone
Yeah.
found useful because I don't know why, but it's out there. And with iOS, it's like,
Yeah.
no, I got to stay in the frameworks, which in general, it's good. But wow, did this open my eyes? Like there's a lot
Right.
of open
Right.
source code out there. Oh, not in Objective-C. I've been very hard pressed. I wanted so badly to make the course, like have like
Uh-huh.
a small Objective-C section, and I just couldn't do it. There's like the only Objective-C code that I could find was like for jailbroken apps and things like that. So I'm like, oh, I can't. It sucks. I may need to contribute to the Objective-C open
I could
source
open source
community.
some of my old Objective-C apps. They're
I was
not
just
any
gonna say,
good, but
Hey,
right. I
everything's
found out today
appreciated.
that the Kickstarter iOS and Android apps are both open sourced. You can go find them on GitHub, the full source code for that, which I thought was really kind of cool. Because it's a pretty high profile
Cool.
app. Yeah, Wikipedia.
I think
right?
Wikipedia
Yeah.
too.
There's some high profile apps that you'd think you're like, no, there's no way. And Wikipedia kind of makes sense because they're a nonprofit, but like Kickstarter, there's not really any. I don't see any particular need for that to be open sourced. But I think it's really really cool that it is because it's definitely. It's not a super complicated app, but I bet you there are more views and there's more involved in that architecture than you probably would maybe think at first glance. So I think that's really cool that stuff like that is available open source because, like I said, unless you work at Facebook, Airbnb, right? One of these companies that has a very high profile iOS app and that the app itself is extremely large, right? I mean, supposedly Facebook has hundreds of engineers that just work on the iOS portion of their company's software, which is bonkers, but it is what it is. Um, that unless you are part of that team, you're just never going to be exposed to things that are that complex. So I think it's really cool when companies, even if they don't necessarily open source their entire app. I mean, Airbnb has open sourced a whole bunch of stuff that they have used. I think Uber has done some. Lyft has done. They have a pretty good sized library of things. Even Facebook has open sourced quite a few things. So it's pretty cool that you can go in there and you can see, not just theorize, right? How maybe would this work, but like you can actually see how it really
Yep.
does work.
It is important to realize, though, that there is a difference between learning from open source code that's out
Yeah.
there and directly relying on it within your own apps. Like as a learning resource, open source is a gold mine. You can learn so much,
Right.
both in good code and in bad code,
Yeah.
about like how to go ahead and improve. Like what you're doing, Fernando, you're finding code that has problems that can be improved. I'm not saying it's the worst code in the world, but every piece of code, there's no such thing as perfect code. Like the same code can be rewritten in so many different ways. Ultimately, it's how readable and understandable it is that is the most important nowadays with our supercomputers running on batteries, right? So, like, the more apps that, especially if they don't have proprietary IP, like Kickstarter does not like their business does not
Right.
fall entirely on their iOS app.
Yeah.
Their iOS app is a convenience for their main business. So that being open
Right.
source, there's nothing wrong with it. No, they would not be hurt if someone made a slightly different Kickstarter app based 90% on their code. There's no issue there for the most part. So if you are in a similar position as a company making an iOS app, do consider open sourcing it because you're going to learn from other people commenting on your own code. Like there's nothing better in a way to kind of find problems than to kind of let someone else loose on it. That said, at the same time, you need to be very careful because a lot of companies, they will open source code
Right.
when they no longer need it, which means it's not going to be actively maintained. It's not something that you should go ahead and completely rely on. be prepared. If you're going to ingest open source code into your own app, understand what it's doing. Don't blindly take code that you have no clue what it's doing because it's too complicated to do something that your app absolutely relies on, because that's going to come around and bite you, especially when it breaks, because you're going to have to fix it and you're not going to have the timeline to be able to really understand everything at that point.
Agreed.
So I just like, I know we've had a troubled commentary in the past from almost all of us. Our students would probably echo this as well, that we've all kind of publicly said that we are kind of against CocoaPods and Carthage and open source and things like that. Like, you shouldn't go ahead and rely on that. And it's hard to give the nuance because there's so many reasons why, but there's also so many reasons why you should embrace it as well and really learn from it. That I agree with Fernando. Like, if we did have, like, we should probably have an episode about why you should and why you shouldn't go ahead and introduce foreign code into your projects, and how to do it in the best way possible, because that's a big topic and there's a ton of nuance there that, like, as a senior developer, we would just say no. Like, that's a simple answer, right? When you don't have any other piece of information as to why you should allow it, like, no, there's no point for doing this. Let's just move on. But there are plenty of yeses. However, it requires that eye to know when it's a yes and when it's a no, and not every senior developer knows what that is. They just have the eye for it, right? They can't tell you. They can't explain how they speak English. They can just speak English, right? We're all under that boat. We're all experts at speaking English, but like, how many of us can explain it?
Well, it's like that whole the whole like explicit, crackdown of things like explicit lyrics and like pornography and stuff in the 80s, right? That there was that famous, I don't know who it was, but somebody said, like, I will recognize this objectionable content when I see it. Like, I can't define it for you, but you can show it to me and I will tell you whether it is or is not objectionable, right? And it's like, it's kind of like that, where sometimes it's a little bit harder to quantify, right, why it might be good or not, but you're like, no, like, this isn't good enough, right? And I feel the way that I've been handling it on my team is basically the answer is no, right? Like, if you're going to ask me, can we include this library in the app, I'm going to say no, but then it's a soft no, right? It's not a hard no, never, don't even ask me, right? It's
Convince
like,
me.
bring it to me and show it to me, and we'll look at it. We'll talk about it. Why you think we need it? What problem it solves for us? How it might be faster than doing something ourselves? Whatever, right? Give me the argument, right? Why this is something that you'd want to do, and then we can decide. And we have actually included a pretty good sized one in our app. We're using SwiftUI in this new app. We're using Combine, and we're also using a thing called the composable architecture, which is a whole kind of methodology for building stuff. It's basically Redux. If for the people in the audience, if you know anything about Redux, which is a state management system for React web applications, this is Redux sort of rewritten to sort of work with Combine and SwiftUI. It's all, of course, written in Swift, and it allows you to have sort of basically finite state, right, in your application, and manage your state effectively. But it's a decent sized library, and it has 2 dependencies. They're all Swift packages, which is nice. No CocoaPods, because that's basically a flat no. Like, if you're going to ask me for a CocoaPod, I'm very likely going to tell you no. Not only because there's the issue of the third-party dependency, but also because CocoaPods itself then inserts itself into the build system and, kind of becomes an issue. Yeah, right. That all by itself. Right. You haven't even had any packages yet. It's already a dependency.
In
so
and of
anyway,
itself,
but that's kind of the stance I've taken, which is like, it's a no, but it's a soft no, right? So like, bring it to me and give me your argument, and then we can talk about it and see whether it's worth it. And I think that's probably the right approach, rather than a hard no, right? Because like you said, right, Dimitri, there's lots of great software out there, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. On the other hand, you have that scenario from a couple of years ago where I don't know what the thing did. It was like a 2-line library buried in JavaScript somewhere. That was like a node dependency that did some kind of padding for strings, and the developer, and literally
and everyone depended on it.
And the guy that originally wrote it got ticked off for some reason and yanked it from the like public sphere, and it broke half the internet because of a 2-line thing. And it was like, that is an example of third-party dependencies run amok, right? And like, and that is not what we want to strive for, right? But I think it's also unfair to kind of go too far the other direction and say like, no, never, no dependencies ever allowed, because then you end up in a scenario where you're writing everything from scratch, right? You have that the famous not invented here problem, which, if for those of you that don't know, what that means is like the tendency of particularly senior level developers to reject anything that they didn't write as not good enough. Not invented here, right? It wasn't invented by me, so it's not any good. And the only way it's going to get included in the sort of the delivery is if we wrote it. And I feel like that is too dogmatic a position to take, right? Because for one thing, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, right? We're already utilizing tons of software that we didn't write. So it seems silly to then say, well, it's okay if Apple provides that software, but nobody else is smart enough or good enough to provide software for our package. Like, that's nonsense. But it's like you said, I just spent 5 minutes explaining this, and I feel like I still haven't done a very good job. Like it's a weird and very nuanced problem, and I feel like that's part of what's difficult about explaining this, particularly to juniors, is that they don't understand the nuance, right? And they don't get, probably because they haven't been burned enough, they don't understand why not? Why can't I just include this in the thing? It'll be great. It's like, well, yeah, but it could be a nightmare, right? It could easily turn into a support nightmare, or just tons of tech.
Like the PTSD.
So all this time we've been doing them a disservice by telling them no, right? They should have been doing it and learning from that problem. Right?
No, because then
every
then
problem
it's
that
your
comes
problem.
up, it's like, oh well, this is something
True,
that you have to keep account if you want to use third party. And at every turn, there's a new problem. At a certain point, like we've all experienced that, and that's why we say no. Like we don't want to go through that ever again. So we kind of
I also feel like
draw the
depending
line
on
at that
the
point.
educational
But-
environment, right? Like at Lambda School, we didn't really have time to let them go crazy with a million third-party libraries that all break, and then you have to help
there's
them
no
fix
time at
them.
all.
Whereas I feel like Fernando's design is set up in a way where you probably wouldn't want to like be like, okay, pool's open, you can do whatever you want, and I'll help you fix it. But you certainly have a lot more room, I think, to play around with those ideas and let them fail more than maybe we had time for in a more structured environment. And so you have more opportunity to like
Absolutely.
to
We've discussed
give
this
them
before.
more, like, for lack of a better term, like give them more leash, right? To like let them venture off more on their own, but still knowing that like it's okay if you make a mistake. I'll help you. I'll help you fix it.
I agree. We've discussed this before, like in our private chats. But I'm totally like the concept of the course in the end is for you to improve in whatever way you need to improve. Like if you need to improve in the sense that I tell you go and change this label and you rewrite the whole app, like that's what you need to improve, right? Because it happens all the time. And I'm prepared. I mean, like again, I only have one person, but I'm totally prepared to getting someone going in a few stories and then them just blowing up the app. And that's your lesson. That's why you're here. It's not about like me teaching you delegation or me teaching you whatever. It's for you to do that and for me to say, you messed up, you're fired, and then you're not fired, but you remember next time you want to do that and you're like, oh no.
It's the Zen school of programming. I love it.
So
whatever you screwed up on, that's your lesson.
And you can take it in
exactly.
You can take it in 2 points of view, right? You can be offended by Fernando's comments and not learn anything, or you can stop to think about why Fernando's telling you to do that change. Like there's a reason for it, and if you don't realize that reason, that's when you need to stop and think about it or ask. Like there's a million ways to go about this without like getting mad. But it's so easy when someone like criticizes your code. They're not criticizing you. They're criticizing what you wrote because it's not good enough. Like there's a reason why they criticized it, and maybe it's a reason because you didn't explain it. Like maybe your code is top notch, perfect, but you put 0 comments in there or you misnamed your variables. That's not gonna be helpful enough. Like the whole point is for others to understand it, not for the computer to understand it. That's what a compiler's for.
And you can
We've solved that problem.
hideous code.
The
that
code
will
is for
compile
other
just
humans,
fine, right? Like, so it's not about the computer; it's about the humans. Yeah, I totally agreed.
Yeah.
So, Fernando, where can people learn more and where can they try out this course?
I will leave a link somewhere in
In the
our
show notes, we're going to tweet about it.
notes.
We'll let you all know. Just follow us. Just follow Code Completion, and we'll give you all the details.
I think that's the perfect solution. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Dimitri, for asking.
Sounds good. Any last comments?
Go
Yeah.
and buy the course, please.
Yeah,
I need
more
to
than
feed
one.
my
He
baby.
needs many more than one student.
Yes, more than one would be amazing. 2 would double my income from the course. So please go ahead and do that.
Wonderful. So, on the topic of teaching and learning, this week's episode is once again brought to you by Bon Voyage, a new full stack iOS application development course from Johnny B. With this course, you'll learn how to build both a full iOS client app and associated React web application to administer it. The app and the site will integrate with Firebase, as well as Stripe and Plaid for payment processing. Bon Voyage is a place to book extravagant vacations where you'll gain the skills to build the iOS app from the ground up and integrate everything you need to provide a world-class vacation booking experience. To find out more and sign up for the course, visit bonvoyage.app/course. That's bon-voyage.app/course. And be sure to follow Bon Voyage's instructor at Johnny B Codes, that's JONNYBCODES, on Twitter to stay up to date with all his courses. Thanks again to Bon Voyage e-commerce app course for sponsoring Code Completion. So with all that out of the way, it's time for Compiler Error, a segment where I get to test my fellow completionists' knowledge about Swift, Apple, and all things development. Today, my 4 statements have a theme, and they are all about FireWire.
I'm going to make a prediction that I'm going to get this totally wrong.
Oh, I'm gonna kill it. And by kill it, I mean it's gonna kill me.
So let's put both of you under the fire and talk about FireWire. So we have 4 statements for you today, and let's go through them. So number 1, FireWire comes in 3 protocol flavors: FireWire 400 over a 4-pin connector, FireWire 600 over a 6-pin connector, and FireWire 800 over a 9-pin connector. Statement number 2. The technology behind FireWire, known as IEEE 1394, was not only used in consumer electronics, but also automobiles, military vehicles, and even satellites. Statement number 3. So FireWire was expected to reach speeds up to 6.4 gigabits per second over single mode fiber, but development was largely halted after 2010 and fully withdrawn in 2013. And statement number 4. Unlike USB, where there is a single host to the topology of network-connected devices, FireWire implements a pure peer-to-peer network, allowing for multiple hosts and devices to share the same bus for communication. So, Ben, since it's been a while since you joined the show,
Great.
and since you had so much confidence,
Super excited.
let's have you go first.
So let's see. Number 1 sounds reasonable. The whole 800 but 9-pin thing is strange, but also it seems totally plausible considering that oftentimes these protocol definitions are often a little nonsensical. So I could believe that. I'm just going to assume that that's correct and move on. I do feel like it is IEEE 1394. That sounds familiar, but that's just based on like no actual knowledge, just like a gut feeling. And consumer electronics is definitely true. Automobiles have FireWire connections? Maybe. Military, if automobiles, then why not military vehicles? Satellites also feel like that could be true. So that all seems plausible. Again, we'll go with true for now. Number 3, the max speed, and then the whole it kind of shut down there towards the beginning of the 2010s. I also feel like that's probably, at least the timeline sounds true, because that FireWire definitely seemed very promising for a long time, and then just didn't get adopted as much as maybe it should have. And then just sort of fizzled out in favor of other things, faster USB and then like Thunderbolt and stuff like that. So seems reasonable. And then the whole USB being single host versus FireWire being a peer-to-peer network. I never really bothered to pay too much attention as to why FireWire was arguably better than USB. I feel like this different style of of communication could be one of those pluses. So, unfortunately, all four of these seem very plausible to me, knowing very little about FireWire itself. I'm gonna go with. It's either something well, it's always right, something obvious, or some tiny little technicality that he's thrown in here to throw us off. No, he would never do that, right?
Dude, he would never.
I'm gonna say that I'm just gonna go crazy. I'm just gonna say number 3 is the compiler error, and that it is because the dates are probably slightly different than what they really are. And that's just that's a shot in the dark. I have no confidence in that answer, but that's what I'm going with. Good luck, Fernando.
Okay, Fernando, will you use that knowledge to help you? Will you use it to step away from that answer?
I'm
It's
leaving.
up to you.
Bye, guys. I'm pretty sure it's not a 9-pin connector. It's a 9.3 pin connector. And Dimitri...
0.3 of copper is very,
yes, of course.
very significant.
This is difficult. I can see number 2 being correct, so I'm gonna ignore that one. I think number 3 may be correct. Time is difficult to measure because 2010 seems like so close regarding FireWire, but so long ago. Like it's the quantum state of technology. Where it's like I don't think there was a Mac in 2010 that had FireWire, but I also don't know. I don't know. The fourth one sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo. So I will say that is correct. I think it's number 1 because I just cannot for the life of me remember FireWire 600.
Yeah, that did sound a little fishy.
I remember FireWire 400.
Yeah.
I remember 800. I remember it specifically because last year I was trying to find... I don't know what I had. I had a device here that was using FireWire. And I was trying to find like a FireWire to Thunderbolt 3. And I figured if I bought like a Thunderbolt 3 to 2 and then a 2 to 1 and then a 1 to FireWire, I could make it work. But apparently you need like an energy source or something, and it never worked. So I'm going to go with number 1.
I'm going to change my answer to number 1 because I agree that 6... Oh,
you cannot change your
dang
answer.
It.
Yes!
But you're right. It sounds very fishy, right? The 600 thing sounds fishy. I don't... Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah,
that's the downside of going first, right? So to help with this, when do you think Apple stopped using FireWire? Or put another way, when did they start using Thunderbolt?
So 2012, I had a laptop that I am fairly certain did not have Thunderbolt. Which means that I don't think there was any time where like FireWire was gone and Thunderbolt didn't exist yet. So I think it was kind of a switch. Like they got rid of FireWire in favor of Thunderbolt instead. So, and I'm almost positive that laptop did not have Thunderbolt, which means it very likely had a FireWire connection that I never used. So when did they make like a big change between that model MacBook Pro and like the next one? I want to say it was I think the 2015s even had FireWire, right? Because they were prior to the Touch Bar ones.
So 2012 was the first time that Thunderbolt kind of was used via the DisplayPort thing because the chassis got so small. That was the first
that makes sense.
Unibody Retina laptops. So the chassis got really small. So Thunderbolt was like the only thing.
Thunderbolt 3, which was
I was going to say the first gen. It wasn't the only thing. The Ethernet.
Yeah, the thick one. So that was all in around 2001, 2011, 2012.
12, I agree.
Now, when do you think FireWire started being developed?
started being developed.
This is going to make the number
94.
4 a little. Yeah.
I've been muted. 94.
86.
Wow.
Whew.
Yeah. So FireWire
It's older than
is
me.
is quite old. Now it didn't make it into a Macintosh until like 99, I think. So there was some lead time there, but it is a fairly old technology. So let's start with number 4, since that you both agree on that one. Now USB, it was a relatively newer technology, but if we all remember USB 1, it was not fast, right? So the key piece to FireWire was the fact that it was really, really fast. It was starting off at 400 megabits per second. Like, that was the speeds that you could realistically attain over the initial version of the protocol. And I think there were like different variants that you could have, 100, 200, 400. But it was all part of that same protocol. Like, you can just negotiate different speeds based on what you needed. So FireWire was way, way faster than USB, even in the very early days. And the second thing was that FireWire was more expensive because you had to have a dedicated chip to handle the connection that did not even communicate with the CPU. So the CPU was like, had a very hands-off approach, and it can just buffer data to the FireWire bus, and then the FireWire bus would take care of the rest, communicating back and forth, which makes sense when you have a communication standard that's at 400 megabits when most computers were not. So that kind of allowed multiple devices to kind of communicate with each other. You can have multiple hosts, not just one or two, but several on the same topology. You can have multiple devices on that same topology. You can use it for networking. So number 4 is true, but that goes to number 2 as well being true, because it's that technology, that topology map, that was actually used in all sorts of different scenarios, including satellites. So once you have a multiple peer-to-peer system, how do you go ahead and reliably communicate between them? Well, it used the same protocol and same communication standard that IEEE 1394, which was born as FireWire by Apple. That's where that all came together. So now that leaves our 2 others. So let's start with
FireWire
you, Ben,
was an
since you
Apple
went
invented
first.
technology, but didn't show up in their computers until 1999.
So they started developing it as a replacement for SCSI, I think,
Right.
as like an improvement to that. And it wasn't until 1999 that they really kind of solidified it as like a product to sell. But they submitted it much earlier to the IEEE, whatever that stands for, International. I'm going to guess
No,
European
it's the
Electronic
International
something.
of
No,
Electrical Engineers is the
engineering.
last 2 E's.
Yeah.
International.
Also,
Yeah,
this
so-
was a jobless
true.
Apple, so no surprise it took 13 years to ship.
Fair enough. But yeah, so that was absolutely used everywhere. So now FireWire was continued to be developed after Apple kind of stopped using it. And this was after FireWire 800. There were a few other variants, FireWire 1600 and 3200, that went and really pushed the limits as far as what it could achieve on the same cable. And there were talks to bring it over single mode fiber. So single mode fiber is a really thick fiber cable where you have one strand rather than multiple strands. That's multi-mode fiber. So you have one strand of fiber, and they were going to push 6.4 gigabits, which seems like a lot at the time until you remember Thunderbolt 1 had 10 and kind of pushed everything out of the competition. Even to this day, like Thunderbolt 4 can push 80 gigabits per second, which is quite phenomenal over copper. So FireWire had its time. It kind of suffers from the same problems that Thunderbolt suffered from, where you have really expensive controller chips on every device to kind of communicate everything. And that's why USB was just cheaper. You just have one single chip to kind of communicate that. So number 3 is unfortunately not the compiler error. Sorry, Ben, which is kind of why I prevented you from switching right at that moment. Because Fernando, you did get it right. There is no FireWire 600. So there is a 6-pin connector, and that was the traditional FireWire connector. And there was a 4-pin connector, which was used for like smaller devices. It's kind of like the USB-B type plug. that you'd plug into your camcorder or whatnot. And they were both capable of FireWire 400 speeds, so just depending on how you wanted to use the connection. And FireWire 400 was that initial flavor of FireWire that was available. Later, there was FireWire 800, which gave you 800 megabits over a 9-pin connector. And as I said, there were more flavors than just those two, plus the one fictional one, being the 16 and the 3200. So yeah, there was never a FireWire 600, even though most people kind of got confused because there's a 6-pin connector and a 9-pin connector that they assumed was the 8. And then there was a 4-pin connector, which people assumed must have been older and slower, even though it was the same kind of technology that was being used. So great job, Fernando.
I just
Sorry,
need to
Ben,
change
that you
one
had to go
vote, and
first.
I could totally win.
I will-
But, it's fine.
I will be
We are-
magnanimous in my victory. This is a time to heal, Ben. I invoke unity in the Code Completion podcast.
And to prevent further writing of our podcast, I will jump in and say that for all of our engineer friends who are watching or listening and or watching, the IEEE is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. So just so we get that right. Real time follow up. No.
Yeah, we are not part of that institute.
Or are we? No, we're not.
Okay. So, as always, I want to personally thank everyone for listening in this week. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Code Completion to know when new episodes get released, and feel free to tweet at us if there's a specific topic you'd like for us to dig into. More importantly, as a small podcast, please be sure to share this with your friends and family who are interested in any part of the process of app development. It's your support that enables us to continue doing this, and we hope to grow a healthy community around everything we discuss. So once again, I want to give my thanks to Ben, who is at Ferris Guy on Twitter, and Fernando, who is at From Junior to Senior on Twitter. And my name once again is Dimitri. You can find me at Dimitri Buñol, and we'll see you all next week. Bye.
Bye.